to my new book review. This time I'm going to talk about this book that I recently finished, Black and Female by Tsitsi Dangaremba. Tsitsi Dangaremba is a Zimbabwean author, filmmaker, and activist. She's best known for her groundbreaking novel titled Nervous Conditions. This novel explores themes including colonialism, gender, and identity, which are themes that also come back in this book that I read. But I would say that this book is more personal, as it is a collection of different essays in which she really talks about what it means to be Black and women in a world that marginalizes both identities. So what I want to talk about in this video is some background about the author, Tsitsi Dangaremba, a little bit background about Zimbabwe during the time in which she lived and that she writes about. And then I want to close with some personal reflections and thoughts that I had after finishing this book. Tsitsi Dangaremba was born in 1959 in southern Rhodesia, which is today known as Zimbabwe. Both her parents were lecturers in a mission school nearby, and her mom was actually the first Black woman in Zimbabwe to obtain her bachelor's degree. She also had an older brother, and Tsitsi and her family, they lived in England between the age of 2 to 6 years old because her parents pursued higher education. And in her book, she describes the impact that this has had on her as a young girl. So Tsitsi and her brother, they lived with a foster family, and she went to a school with little to no Black children. This had shaped also how she looked at herself as a Black girl. When Tsitsi was 6 years old, she and her family moved back to Zimbabwe. She continued her education there, and she did this in a prestigious school. And she returned to England to study in Cambridge University, but because of the discrimination that she faced, she returned earlier to continue her studies in Zimbabwe. So in the first essay, Tsitsi Dangaremba describes how writing has become a way for her to continuously analyze how her identity has been shaped by her personal as well as country's history. So in the first chapter, we read how her experience as a young child arriving and living in England has influenced her image of looking at herself. So she writes that what she learned at a very young age is to not trust happy feelings, because one of her earliest memories that she describes is the moment when she arrived at the living room in an English house. And the living room was filled with toys, and like any other child, she was very happy to play there with the toys, and she played for a long time with her brother. And by the time she wanted to tell her parents how much fun they have had during the day, she realized that her parents were not there anymore. They had left to study and pursue their education, and she was told that this was going to be her home for the coming period. So this was an introduction to her foster family. So at a very young age, she learned to not trust happy feelings. This was kind of a traumatic experience for her when she was a young girl. And there are similar anecdotes in the first chapter where you really get to understand and feel how it must have been, especially when you realize that she didn't really have anyone to share these stories with, because another thing she describes is that people were not used to dark skins. So she was also harming herself, but people didn't know how to analyze a darker skin. So they didn't really recognize the marks or the scars that she caused to her own body. And she started associating her dark skin with the darkness of the night that she feared as a child. So yeah, it was pretty shocking to read this kind of anecdotes, and also very touching. Also wrote something else that I found interesting. She wrote that her parents went to England to pursue their education there because they received a scholarship from the government, because providing people with scholarships to study in the colonial country, in this case England, contributes to an increased influence of England in Zimbabwe when those people will return. So that was also an interesting insight that I got. I never really thought about why countries provided scholarships to students to study abroad, and reading this was kind of insightful and new for me. So that was also something that I made a note of. And in the rest of the essay, she describes her experience of how she started enjoying writing and books, and also about the challenges that she faced as a Black writer. But she also writes that writing for her became a way to be more than a woman and Black, because she was writing, she was telling a story. In the second essay, Dangaremba reflects on growing up in a post-colonial society and how this influenced her understanding of feminism. She discusses the challenges of being both Black and women, and she also sheds light on a topic that I find particularly interesting, which is the influence of Western feminism on African women. What she writes is that often Western feminism fails to highlight the unique struggles that Black women face and that are unique to their experience and that other women don't necessarily are challenged with. And this is where she mentions the term intersectionality, which inspired me to write my new blog. And I think it's really nice how she has described the importance of looking at gender inequality from different perspectives. What I really like is how she highlights the need for feminism to be not only inclusive, but also sensitive to cultural and historical realities of Black women. In the third essay, titled Decolonization as Revolutionary Imagination, Tsitsi Dangaremba dives into the concept of decolonization, describing that decolonization is not merely a political or social process, but requires an act of creative and imaginary reconstruction. In this essay, Dangaremba argues that decolonization involves reimagining and redefining identities, narratives, and realities that have been shaped by colonial powers. She highlights that true decolonization requires more than just the removal of colonial structures. It demands a radical rethinking of the ways in which people perceive themselves and especially their places into societies. So in this chapter, Dangaremba writes that questions about human value have everything to do about the position of humans into society. Especially in colonial countries, you'll find that people measure and define their position in societies based on the distance between them and people with a white skin color. Black people will always be confronted with not being white, which often leads to many traumas. So what Tsitsi Dangaremba also wrote in her book was that in her childhood, she felt this position and the pain as an emptiness. As a child growing up in a white foster family, she always felt like there was something where she didn't belong to. It was something where she didn't dare to be, but it also meant that she couldn't completely exist. She felt as if she was living next to herself and not integrating within herself, which caused trauma that was never completely healed. I had to read this several times to really understand what she means, but how I read this is that she grew up in a place where she never really felt as she fitted, which makes it hard to really develop your identity. So in a way, you are supposed to act like you belong somewhere while you don't, or you feel like you don't. So that is how I interpret it. And she also talks about different parts of her life in which you can see the distance that she always experienced between Black people and white people. For example, the school system, in which there was a clear separation between white and Black students. But also the fact that when she played outside in England with children, it was never the white children that came by to her house to play with them. She also never saw another Black child when she was growing up in England. What she also wrote is that many people in Zimbabwe knew how to have different identities. So people could have a relatively higher position in communities with similar people. So in this context, I think it's Black people. So in the Black community, they could be somebody who was considered prestigious and somebody who was respected. But at the same time, when those people were among white people, they considered themselves inferior. So that is what she writes in this chapter, that decolonization requires a change in this type of thinking, because it's not only the white people, but it's also the black people who have this way of identifying themselves within a society that requires a change. And even today, when people refer to somebody who is respected, they refer to this person as Murungu Wangu, which means my white. What I also found shocking was when I read the part in which she refers to enlightenment. It has had a significant influence on Western thinking and structures, but she writes several examples of well-known philosophers from the Enlightenment, including Immanuel Kant, Voltaire, Hegel, John Locke, who have racial theories that are just so shocking. I don't even want to read it here, but just to give one small sentence. The French philosopher from the Enlightenment, Voltaire, wrote, "Only blind people would hesitate that white people, the Negroes and the albinos, Chinese and the Americans are complete different races." So yeah, when I was reading this, it just really felt awkward, but it is what these philosophers wrote, and yeah, it's just unimaginable. And she also mentions that there are more and more stories about children who grew up in white foster families and the traumas that this has caused to them. And finally, I want to share this example that she mentioned. So she refers to the fact that during the pandemic, Botswana, together with a Zimbabwean virologist, identified the COVID virus. So instead of appreciating the efforts of these countries and the fact that they were successful in identifying the virus, they implemented a travel ban. Newspapers wrote, "The African virus arrived in Europe," while everybody knew that the virus is not originating from Africa. So I think this example shows also Tsitsi Dangaremba's point of the urgent need to reshape the way we think about identities, and that we need to imagine and create new realities. So my reflection on this book is that it was really insightful, it was shocking, there were personal anecdotes that were really touching, and I think it was interesting to read through the different parts of her life in which she was living in different parts of the history of Zimbabwe. And yeah, I reflected on this topic, and I wrote a blog about intersectional feminism and why I think it's the only way of feminism that works. I posted it on Instagram and got a notification that it's not in line with their policies. I don't agree with that. So yeah, if you have any thoughts or feedback on why it could not be in line with the policies, let me know. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I enjoyed reading the book, and I will definitely read more books of her. And since she's also a filmmaker, I will also try to see if I can find some movies, and yeah, who knows, maybe I will talk about it in my next video. Bye!